"We did not order a portion for your son," my sister Felicity said, with a sweet smile sliding a basket of cold dinner rolls toward my 8-year-old. I watched her own children cut into their imported wagyu steaks, while my father casually added that I should have packed a lunchbox if I knew I could not afford to feed him here. I did not scream or cause a scene. I simply smiled, called the waiter back, and paid for my son with a card they had never seen before. When the restaurant manager returned with the real bill, my family realized the VIP discount they thought they had was entirely my doing. My name is Lydia, 34 years old, and if you have ever had your child humiliated by the people who are supposed to be your family, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below, and hit subscribe because what I did to them over the next 3 weeks will make you rethink every family dinner you have ever attended. The Reserve is widely known as the most exclusive Michelin-starred steakhouse in Chicago. Getting a table requires either waiting 6 months or possessing a significant amount of corporate leverage. My family believed they were dining there simply because my father, Richard, was the president of a mid-level supply chain company. He carried himself with the unearned arrogance of a billionaire wearing an outdated tailored suit and loudly complaining about the valet service. My mother, Patricia, sat beside him, dripping in jewelry she bought on credit, actively fawning over Felicity and her husband, Carter. My brother Spencer sat across from me, already on his 3rd glass of expensive bourbon that he fully expected my father to pay for. I sat at the far end of the long mahogany table with my son, Leo. I was wearing a simple, unbranded, cashmere sweater which my mother had already criticized as looking too cheap for such an establishment. The waiter arrived with a massive silver tray, serving the beautifully seared tomahawk steaks to Felicity's 2 children. The kids immediately started tearing into the meat, chewing loudly and dropping pieces onto the pristine white tablecloth. The waiter then placed the remaining entrees in front of the adults. I waited patiently for him to bring a plate for Leo. When the waiter stepped back and bowed slightly, signifying the end of the service, I looked around the table. Leo looked up at me, his small hands resting politely in his lap, trying to hide his disappointment. I looked directly at my sister, who was busy taking a photo of her plate for social media. "I think the kitchen missed an order," I said calmly. "Leo does not have his food." Felicity put her phone down and let out a dramatic sigh, rolling her eyes as if I were a burden she could barely tolerate. "We did not order for him, Lydia. You know how expensive this place is. You do data entry from your living room. Carter and I are not running a charity." She picked up a basket of leftover dinner rolls from the center of the table and pushed it across the polished wood toward my son. "Here he can fill up on bread. Kids do not know the difference anyway." I felt a cold, sharp clarity wash over me. I did not raise my voice, but my father decided to jump in, cutting his steak with aggressive sawing motions. "Felicity is right," Richard said, pointing his knife at me. "You should have packed him something from home. A sandwich, or whatever it is you people eat. You are lucky we even let you sit at this table. You bring down the image of the entire family looking like a broke single mother." I looked at Patricia, expecting at least a shred of grandmotherly intervention, but she was busy wiping a spot of sauce from Carter's lapel, completely ignoring her grandson. Spencer snickered quietly into his glass of bourbon. "Noted," I said. My voice was completely steady. I turned to the waiter who was hovering nearby, looking incredibly uncomfortable with the family dynamic playing out in front of him. "Excuse me," I called out softly. The waiter rushed over. "I would like to order the Kobe Reserve cut for my son. Medium well, please, and a side of truffle mac and cheese." Felicity scoffed loudly. "Are you insane? That cut is almost $400. Dad is not paying for that, and you certainly do not have that kind of money in your checking account. Do not embarrass us by getting your card declined." I opened my purse and pulled out a heavy, solid metal black card. It was a Centurion card, issued only by private invitation to high net worth individuals. I handed it to the waiter. "Put my son's entire meal on this," I instructed. "And while you are at the terminal, please access the reservation profile under my name. You will see a corporate VIP code applied to this table for a 40% discount. I would like you to remove that code. Charge them the full retail price for everything they have ordered tonight." The waiter looked at the heavy black metal in his hand, then at the name, then bowed deeply. "Right away, madam." Felicity's face twisted in confusion. "What are you talking about? Carter booked this table through his networking club." Carter suddenly looked very interested in his napkin. "Actually," he mumbled, "the concierge said a VIP sponsor had already cleared the table and applied a corporate rate. I assumed it was a perk from my firm." "It was not I," said, taking a sip of my sparkling water. "It was a perk from Apex Solutions, my company. I thought it would be a nice gesture for our parents' anniversary. But since we are separating the checks and evaluating who can afford what, I think it is only fair you pay the market rate." 20 minutes later, the restaurant manager approached the table carrying 2 leather folders. He placed my card and a receipt for Leo's meal in front of me, thanking me profusely for my patronage. Then he placed the other folder in front of Richard and Carter. Felicity confidently threw her platinum credit card onto the tray. The manager returned 3 minutes later, looking apologetic. "I am so sorry, ma'am. Your card has been declined." Felicity turned crimson. "That is impossible. Try it again. Run it for the $4,500. We have tried twice," the manager said politely. "The bank indicates insufficient funds." Richard snatched the bill, his face turning an alarming shade of purple when he saw the total without the 40% discount. $4,500 for steaks and wine? This is extortion! He reached for his own wallet, his hands shaking with fury. I stood up, helping Leo down from his chair. My son had just finished the best meal of his life and was smiling happily. I smoothed down his collar and picked up my purse. "Enjoy the rest of your evening," I said, looking down at the panicked faces of my family. "And Felicity, next time you decide to feed my son scraps, make sure you can actually afford your own meal first. Happy anniversary, Mom and Dad." "Finish paying the bill before you leave." The Uber ride back to our apartment was peaceful. Leo fell asleep leaning against my shoulder, completely unaware of the financial execution that had just taken place. My phone, however, was practically vibrating out of my purse. The family group chat was exploding. I opened the messaging app and watched the chaos unfold in real time. Patricia had sent a barrage of angry texts in all capital letters. "You are an absolute disgrace. Your father had to call his business partners to borrow money to cover the bill. You humiliated us in front of the entire restaurant. We are the laughingstock of Chicago because of your petty jealousy." Felicity chimed in immediately after. "You think you are so smart with that fake metal card. We all know you do cheap data entry from your living room. You probably stole that corporate code from your boss. Or worse, you are sleeping with some old rich man just to pretend you have money. You are pathetic." Reading her words, I felt a familiar wave of cold detachment. 5 years ago, I had divorced a highly manipulative man who wiped out our joint savings on his way out the door. When I turned to my family for help, Richard had offered me a minimum wage job as a receptionist at his supply chain company, telling me it was the best a failed wife could hope for. I declined his insulting offer, took Leo, and walked away with nothing. They spent the next 5 years assuming I was barely scraping by, doing mindless administrative tasks online. They never bothered to learn that my data entry was actually the foundational coding for a financial technology platform. Apex Solutions was now the payment processing backbone for hundreds of major corporations across the United States. I did not just work from home. I ran an empire from my home office. Spencer suddenly joined the group chat, typing out a threat that made me raise an eyebrow. "You messed with the wrong people tonight. Dad just called the building management where you live. He is removing his name as your guarantor on the lease. You have 24 hours to pack your trash and get out. Prepare to move into a homeless shelter by morning because you are officially cut off. I stared at the glowing screen in the dark back seat of the Uber. Spencer and Richard truly believed they held the keys to my survival. When I first moved into my luxury apartment complex, Richard had insisted on signing as a guarantor, claiming my freelance income was too unstable for the landlord to accept. He loved holding that signature over my head, threatening to cancel the lease whenever I did not comply with family demands. I did not reply to the group chat. I simply smiled ope and a secure legal application on my tablet and reviewed the property acquisition documents that had been finalized just 3 days ago. Let them think they had won the night. Morning was going to be a completely different story. The morning sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse apartment. I was sitting at my kitchen island, sipping a dark roast espresso and reviewing a quarterly earnings report when the heavy, aggressive pounding on my front door began. I checked the security camera feed on my tablet. Richard and Spencer were standing in the hallway, looking furious, self-righteous, and entirely too smug. Richard was clutching a manila folder, tapping his foot impatiently. I unlocked the door and pulled it open. "Good morning," I said pleasantly. "To what do I owe this early visit?" Richard pushed past me without an invitation, marching straight into my living room. Spencer followed closely behind, smirking as he looked around my meticulously decorated space. "We are here to collect," Richard barked, slamming the manila folder onto my quartz countertop. "You owe me $4,500 for last night. You are going to sign a promissory note right now. And then you are going to call your sister and beg for her forgiveness. If you do not, I am contacting the leasing office and having you thrown out on the street today. I own shares in the management company of this building. I can have security bag your things in an hour." Spencer leaned against the wall, crossing his arms. "I told you, Dad. She is too arrogant for her own good. Throw her and the kid out. Let them see what the real world is like without our protection." I slowly placed my espresso cup down. I did not raise my voice, nor did I show a single ounce of fear. "You want to call the leasing office?" I asked politely. "Please, be my guest. In fact, let me save you the trouble." I walked over to the wall-mounted intercom system and pressed the button for the management office. "Yes, Miss Lydia?" A professional voice answered immediately. "Good morning, Mr. Davis. Could you please come up to my unit? We have a slight trespassing issue that requires your clarification." "Right away, madam." Richard let out a harsh, barking laugh. "You think the building manager is going to save you? I play golf with the owner of this development group. My minority shares give me enough leverage to ensure a deadbeat like you gets evicted before lunch." We waited in silence. 2 minutes later, a crisp knock sounded at the open door. Mr. Davis, the senior property manager, stepped inside. He was wearing a sharp suit and carried a sleek leather binder. "Ah, Davis," Richard said, puffing out his chest and stepping forward. "Good, you are here. I need you to initiate an immediate eviction protocol for this unit. I am pulling my guarantor status, and as a shareholder in the management group, I want her out today." Mr. Davis did not even look at Richard. He walked straight past him, stopped in front of me, and bowed his head slightly in a gesture of profound respect. "Good morning, Miss Lydia. How can I assist you today?" I gestured gracefully toward my father. "Mr. Davis, it seems this gentleman believes he has the authority to dictate the tenancy of this building based on his minority shares in your former management group. Could you please update him on the current ownership structure?" The property manager turned to Richard, his expression entirely professional. "Sir, the entity in which you once held a small, indirect interest no longer manages this complex. Its controlling owners approved a portfolio sale, and every minority interest was cashed out through the closing escrow yesterday. The transaction notice and your payout statement were delivered through the shareholder portal." Richard's face dropped. "What sale? Nobody asked my permission." The manager opened his leather binder and placed the recorded ownership certificate beside Richard's manila folder. The buyer is an irrevocable property trust established for Leo. Lydia is the acting trustee and authorized manager, which means the trust, not your former management company, controls the buildings, the operating accounts, and this residence. Spencer pushed himself away from the wall. You are lying. She could not have bought a $50 million complex. The manager did not react. Mr. Richard, your former guarantee has no effect on this unit because the trust owns it and Lydia occupies it under the trust agreement. You entered after she told you to wait, and you are now being instructed to leave. If you refuse, building security will escort you out and document the trespass for the police. The decision belongs to the owner, not to a former minority investor. I picked up my espresso, taking a slow, deliberate sip as I watched the blood completely drain from my father's face. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The man who had spent his entire life making me feel small was currently shrinking under the weight of a reality he could not comprehend. I suggest you take Mr. Davis's advice, I said, my voice echoing coldly in the vast living room. And Dad, make sure you save whatever money you get from those liquidated shares. You are going to need it to pay off the dinner bill. Have a safe trip down the elevator. The heavy oak door clicked shut, sealing out my father and brother. I did not waste a single second celebrating their panicked retreat. I simply walked back to my kitchen island, finished my espresso, and opened my laptop. The silence in my penthouse was a stark contrast to the absolute meltdown I knew was happening in the elevator descending to the lobby. Richard and Spencer were men who operated entirely on intimidation. When you strip away their perceived authority, they become nothing more than frightened children. But I knew my family dynamics too well to assume the war was over. Physical intimidation had failed, which meant they would immediately pivot to their favorite and most destructive weapon: social warfare. By noon, my phone was lighting up with a relentless stream of notifications. Felicity had gone nuclear. Unable to digest the reality that the sister she had mocked was actually her landlord, she turned to the only arena where she still felt powerful. She took to social media to orchestrate a meticulously crafted smear campaign. I opened Facebook to find a lengthy, tearful post from my sister, tagged with my parents and brother, generating hundreds of shocked reactions from their country club circle. Felicity claimed our family was going through a severe, heartbreaking crisis because of my declining mental stability. She painted a tragic picture of how I had supposedly manipulated our aging parents, engaged in financial elder abuse to steal my father's real estate shares, and was currently spiraling out of control. She spun a wild narrative that I was suffering from delusions of grandeur, claiming to be a wealthy executive while living entirely off the money I had allegedly extorted from our father. But the true venom of her campaign was reserved for my son. Felicity wrote that she had to protect her own children from Leo. She called my 8-year-old a deeply disturbed boy who lacked a proper father figure and exhibited dangerous behavioral issues. She implied that my mental illness was severely damaging my child, warning other parents to keep their kids away from us. A few minutes later, a friend who lived in Felicity's upscale neighborhood texted me a dozen screenshots from the Oak Ridge Academy parent group chat. Felicity was actively telling the elite private school mothers that I was under psychiatric care. She warned them that my sudden display of a black credit card at the steakhouse was the result of illicit activities and severe identity theft. She was laying the groundwork to ensure that if I ever tried to speak the truth, I would already be branded as a lunatic. This was Felicity's classic playbook. When I left my highly toxic marriage 5 years ago, she did the exact same thing. She whispered to all our relatives that I was having a nervous breakdown, ensuring nobody would offer me a place to stay or a word of comfort. She convinced Patricia and Richard that supporting me would only enable my supposed erratic behavior. It was her way of keeping the spotlight shining brightly on her own perfect life while burying mine in the dirt. My parents had eagerly accepted her lies back then because it absolved them of any parental responsibility. I sat at my multi-monitor desk and watched the comments roll in. Relatives were sending prayers. Patricia commented that her heart was broken for her sick daughter. People were suggesting institutionalization. In the past, this coordinated character assassination would have broken me. I would have drafted a dozen defensive responses, crying over my keyboard, begging people to believe me. But the woman I am today does not argue with narcissists on the internet. Arguing with a smear campaign only validates the premise of the attack. I closed the social media tabs and shifted my attention to the secure compliance portal of Apex Solutions. My company processed payments and provided commercial underwriting services to major clients, but that did not give me permission to browse anyone's private finances simply because I was angry. Carter, however, had recently submitted a business credit and payment processing application through his consulting firm, and the application was still pending. The file contained a signed authorization allowing Apex to verify the company information he supplied, obtain permissible purpose commercial and consumer credit reports, review the statements he uploaded, and check public liens, judgments, and vendor claims. Carter had rushed through the consent screens because he wanted an instant credit line. He had certified that the documents were complete and had handed an independent underwriting team the lawful right to test every representation in his application. I routed the file to enhanced review and required the compliance staff to preserve a complete audit trail. 2 analysts handled the search, while I remained on the executive side of the process. The reports did not reveal some magical secret database. They showed ordinary but devastating facts. Unpaid invoices revolving balances at their limits, recent high-interest loans returned, payments and bank statements Carter himself had uploaded to prove liquidity. Felicity spent her days carrying $10,000 handbags, driving a leased luxury SUV, and looking down on everyone she considered inferior. She projected generational wealth in photographs carefully cropped to hide overdue notices. The documents supporting Carter's application told a completely different story. Oak Ridge Academy appeared repeatedly in the liabilities schedule. 2 tuition drafts had been returned, and a collection notice attached to the application showed that 6 months of tuition remained unpaid. Their children were surviving on a final grace period, while Felicity continued boasting to other parents that $40,000 a year was a small price for prestige. The rest of the file was worse. Carter had stacked short-term loans on top of maxed-out credit cards, then used cash advances to make minimum payments on other accounts. Several transfers on the statements he submitted went to online betting operators and cryptocurrency exchanges identified by the lender's risk system. His consulting revenue could not support the debts, the private school tuition, or the lifestyle Felicity displayed online. I opened the cash flow worksheet. Every month began with borrowed money passed through Carter's consulting account and ended with a new deficit. The expensive car, the club dues, and the polished social media image were not proof of success. They were evidence that the next creditor had not yet arrived. Felicity was calling me unstable, while her household balanced on borrowed money. She had humiliated Leo over a stake to protect an image that was already collapsing, and she was using a smear campaign to distract everyone from the cracks beneath her own feet. The application also contained a signed borrower certification, allowing Apex to compare the uploaded statements with external fraud prevention databases. That comparison confirmed the accounts existed, but it did not transform suspicion into proof. Every serious allegation still required independent investigation. I exported only the records Apex was legally entitled to retain, locked them inside the compliance case file, and instructed counsel to separate verified facts from allegations requiring government investigation. I would not post screenshots or expose her children. I would not answer rumors with rumors. I would answer with documents, dates, and the consequences of the agreements Carter had signed himself. Less than 24 hours after Felicity launched her online smear campaign, branding me a lunatic, my phone rang. I did not need to look at the caller identification to know who it was. It was Patricia. She did not call to ask how I was doing, nor did she call to apologize for my father and brother trying to illegally evict me. She called with a demand, disguised as an ultimatum.
You have embarrassed this family enough with your psychotic episode at the restaurant,
Patricia said, her voice sharp and uncompromising over the speakerphone. I sat at my desk, watching the offshore gambling transfers of her favorite son-in-law scroll across my monitor. Felicity is gracious enough to offer you a path to redemption. Patricia continued, entirely unaware of the silence on my end. She is hosting her annual charity gala this Saturday night. You will attend, but you will not be sitting at a guest table. You will wear a plain white button-down shirt and black slacks. You will serve drinks, you will clear empty plates, and you will show some actual humility. If you do this without causing another scene, your father and I might consider getting you the psychiatric help you clearly need. Normally, I would have hung up the phone and blocked her number. But looking at the encrypted financial audit glowing on my screens, the bounced tuition checks, the maxed-out credit limits, and the frantic bridge loans, I knew exactly why Felicity was hosting a charity gala right now. It had absolutely nothing to do with philanthropy. It was a desperate, illegal attempt to inject cash into Carter's sinking ship before their creditors completely destroyed them. I smiled into the receiver. I would be happy to serve drinks, Mom, I said smoothly. Send me the address. The gala was held in the grand ballroom of a luxury downtown hotel. The space was draped in velvet and lit by massive crystal chandeliers. Floral centerpieces that cost more than my first car adorned every table. Felicity was wearing a custom silk gown, floating through the room like royalty, soaking up the admiration of Chicago high society. Carter stood near the open bar, laughing loudly and shaking hands, projecting the flawless image of a successful entrepreneur. I arrived through the service entrance as instructed. Patricia met me near the coat check and immediately shoved a heavy silver tray loaded with champagne flutes into my hands. Keep your head down and do not speak to anyone, she hissed, adjusting her diamond necklace while glaring at my plain uniform. Just pour the drinks, collect the trash, and stay out of sight. Try not to embarrass us further. I nodded mutely and walked into the catering kitchen to retrieve a bucket of fresh ice. The heavy metal doors swung shut behind me, instantly muffling the classical string quartet playing in the main hall. As I stood under the harsh fluorescent lights, scooping crushed ice into a silver bucket, a familiar, bone-deep exhaustion washed over me. For 20 years, this had been my designated role in the family hierarchy. Whenever my parents hosted Thanksgiving dinners or holiday parties, Spencer and Felicity were encouraged to mingle with the guests, show off their expensive new clothes, and build social connections. I was always handed an apron. I was the one washing dishes while they opened presents in the living room. I was the one boxing up leftovers and taking out the trash while they posed for professional family portraits. They had conditioned me since childhood to believe my only value was invisible, unpaid labor. I was the designated servant the scapegoat kept around, only to make their lives more convenient. I returned to the ballroom, blending seamlessly into the background. A server is essentially invisible to the ultra-wealthy. People look right through you, treating you as an extension of the furniture. That invisibility allowed me to navigate the crowded floor and scan the room for a very specific guest. While carrying the tray through the ballroom, I watched for one particular guest. An IRS criminal investigation supervisory agent was attending as part of a legitimate financial crime outreach program for major charitable events. Apex's compliance department had already filed a confidential referral concerning discrepancies in Carter's commercial application. I had not invited the agent to stage an ambush, and I had not handed him private customer data. He stood near the grand staircase in a plain gray suit, observing the event with the patient focus of someone who noticed details other guests ignored. I approached his table, balanced the tray against my hip, and waited until the lights dimmed. Felicity stepped into the spotlight and dabbed at a perfectly timed tear. "Thank you for supporting the Hope Street Orphanage," she said. "These children depend on leaders like us." Digital donation cards are on every table, and every dollar goes directly to the foundation. The guests nodded, opened their phones, and began scanning the codes printed beside the centerpieces. Carter watched the donation counter on a tablet near the stage, smiling each time the total climbed. I poured the agent a glass of sparkling water. "It is a beautiful appeal," I said quietly. "The payment screen is less beautiful." He paused with the glass halfway to his mouth. "What do you mean?"
I kept my eyes on the tablecloth.
"The Public Charity Registry lists no active organization under that name at the address on the invitation. When the code is scanned, the confirmation screen identifies the recipient as Carter Consulting, not a nonprofit. Anyone in this ballroom can see it, without opening a bank account or using confidential information." He scanned the code himself. A payment page opened under Carter Consulting, with language promising that donations were tax-deductible, even though no charitable registration number appeared. His expression hardened. I placed a folded printout beside his glass. It contained the public registry search, a copy of the solicitation card screenshots of the recipient name, and the compliance contact through which investigators could request authenticated Apex records by subpoena. There was no routing number, taxpayer identification number, or private account history on the page. "Did you prepare this?" he asked. "My company's compliance team preserved what it was legally permitted to preserve," I answered. "The rest is visible on the invitation and the public payment page. I thought someone responsible should compare the two before more guests transferred money." He did not thank me or promise an arrest. He photographed the public materials, sent a message through his secure device, and quietly asked the hotel's event director to preserve the QR card's donation page logs and vendor contract. An investigation still required subpoenas, authentication interviews, and independent decisions by the government. On stage, Felicity smiled as the donation counter rose. She held both hands over her heart, while money intended for children flowed toward a business account controlled by her husband. She never noticed the hotel technology manager copying the payment logs under a preservation request. I continued serving for another 20 minutes so my departure would not draw attention. When I carried the empty tray back through the kitchen, the harsh fluorescent lights no longer made me feel like the unpaid servant of my childhood. I had performed the role they assigned me and used their contempt as camouflage. I left through the service corridor and changed clothes in the back of my car. By the following afternoon, the event organizer had received a formal preservation request, and Carter's bank had been instructed through proper legal channels not to destroy relevant records. No agent announced guilt at the party, and no account vanished by magic. The family went silent because their attorneys understood that the charity appeal had created a documented trail they could no longer erase. For 48 hours, none of them called. Felicity deleted the donation post Carter removed the payment link, and Patricia stopped commenting beneath the smear campaign. Those actions did not erase the records. They only showed that the people who had been loudest about my alleged instability were suddenly terrified of their own paperwork. On Tuesday morning, the silence ended with a hard knock at my penthouse door. The security feed showed Richard, Patricia, Felicity Spencer, and a middle-aged man carrying a leather briefcase. I told the building desk not to send them away yet. I wanted the conversation documented from the beginning, and Leo was already safe in his locked bedroom with the nanny connected to our emergency line. I opened the door, but kept the chain engaged. Richard immediately shoved his shoulder against it and forced the gap wider. "We are here to help you, before you destroy yourself and this family," he snapped. I stepped back only after the hallway camera captured the entry. Patricia swept inside and began crying on command. She said my ownership claims, the restaurant confrontation, and the charity questions proved that I was suffering from grandiose delusions. The man with the briefcase introduced himself as a behavioral specialist and offered a business card. The card listed no medical license, hospital affiliation, or professional registration. It identified him as a holistic life coach. He nevertheless announced that he could evaluate whether I required an involuntary psychiatric hold. Felicity crossed her arms. "Dad has prepared an emergency guardianship petition," she said. "Once our specialist signs the supporting statement, the court will place your assets under family control. We will also seek emergency guardianship of Leo, because a delusional mother cannot protect a child." Their plan was more elaborate than simple bullying, but it was not legally complete. An Illinois court would require an actual petition notice or a justified emergency exception, competent medical evidence, and judicial findings. Custody of Leo would require a separate child welfare proceeding. Their unlicensed coach could not create either order by signing a page in my living room. What they intended was to manufacture a record, force me to leave voluntarily, and later describe that surrender as proof of incapacity. Spencer dropped onto my sofa and put his shoes on the coffee table. "Once the judge sees you in a facility, Dad and I will manage the building, the accounts, and the trust," he said. "You should have stayed quiet." Patricia moved close enough for me to smell her perfume. She reminded me that I had once been hospitalized for exhaustion after my divorce, and twisted that medical event into evidence that I had always been unstable. She said she should have taken Leo years ago. I let them speak until every threat was clear. Then I asked, "Are you finished?" Richard stepped toward me. "Pack a bag and go with him," he ordered. "If you resist, we will tell the police you are dangerous and have you removed in front of your son." I smiled and lifted my phone. The penthouse security system recorded the common areas with visible cameras and stored the files in a protected legal archive. The entry, the false credentials, the threatened petitions, and Richard's demand that I leave with an unlicensed stranger were already preserved with timestamps. The life coach stared at the camera above the kitchen. "I was told this was a voluntary wellness meeting," he said quickly. "I am not signing anything, and I am leaving." He moved toward the door. Patricia grabbed Richard's sleeve, and Spencer began insisting that he had only come to observe. I had also activated the building panic alert when Richard forced the chain door. The police were responding to a reported trespass, coercive threats, and an attempt to remove a resident from her home without lawful authority. I had not reported an imaginary kidnapping, and I did not claim the officers could decide a guardianship dispute in my living room. Their role was to stop the confrontation, identify everyone, and preserve the evidence. Richard heard police radios in the hallway and realized the intervention had failed. His fists tightened, but instead of retreating, he reached for the only weapon he believed remained. "You think cameras make you powerful?" he shouted. "My company is about to be acquired by the largest financial technology group on the East Coast. Next week, I will have enough money to hire lawyers who will bury you and take your son." The footsteps outside grew louder. "Apex Solutions?" I asked lightly. Richard froze. "That name is protected by a non-disclosure agreement." "How do you know it?" "Because my counsel drafted the agreement," I said. "I founded Apex Solutions. I serve as its chief executive, and I control its voting shares. The failing company you plan to sell is being reviewed by me." The police entered as his expression collapsed. I stepped aside, handed the lead officer the recording reference number, and asked that my family be formally removed and warned not to return without permission. The fake doctor dropped his briefcase. "I am leaving," he stammered, backing toward the door. "I was told this was a simple wellness check. I want no part of this illegal mess." He turned and sprinted out the front door, leaving my family standing frozen in the center of my living room. Patricia grabbed Richard's arm. her fake tears entirely gone, replaced by genuine, unadulterated terror. "Richard, do something! She called the police!" Spencer jumped off the couch, holding his hands up defensively. "I did not do anything, I was just standing here. It was Dad's idea." Richard clenched his fist so tightly his knuckles turned white. He glared at me with a hatred so pure it practically vibrated in the air. He knew he had lost this battle. The police sirens were now audible wailing down the street far below my penthouse windows. But a narcissist never truly surrenders. They just look for a bigger weapon.
"You think you won today?" Richard yelled, pointing a shaking finger at my face over the sound of the approaching sirens. "You think a few security cameras are going to save you? You are nothing. You are a lonely, pathetic failure. My supply chain company is in the final stages of a historic merger. Next week, we are signing the paperwork to be acquired by the biggest financial technology conglomerate on the East Coast. Once that deal closes, I am going to have hundreds of millions of dollars in liquid cash. I will be richer than you could ever imagine. I will hire the most ruthless, expensive legal team in the country. I will crush you. I will crush your little data entry business, and I will make sure you never see your son again. You have no idea who you are dealing with." The sirens grew louder, echoing through the city blocks. Heavy footsteps and the sound of police radios began to echo in the hallway outside my door. "A massive tech conglomerate on the East Coast," I asked, keeping my tone light and conversational. "Let me guess, you are referring to the corporate buyout by Apex Solutions." Richard blinked, momentarily thrown off balance by my knowledge of his confidential business dealings. "How do you know that name?" "That merger is strictly under non-disclosure agreements." I crossed my arms and offered him a devastatingly polite smile. "Because I am the one who drafted the non-disclosure agreements, Dad. I am the founder, the chief executive officer, and the sole majority shareholder of Apex Solutions. You are trying to sell your failing company to me." "Good luck with the merger," I said, right as 3 police officers stepped through the open doorway. The officers separated everyone, reviewed the hallway footage, and took statements. Richard was booked for criminal trespass and coercive conduct after refusing repeated orders to leave. The others were released with written trespass warnings while prosecutors reviewed the evidence. No judge had declared anyone guilty, and no private dispute had magically become a federal case. The building issued a formal no trespass notice. My lawyer preserved the recordings, and the false coach confirmed that he had never been authorized to diagnose me. What mattered was that the intervention was documented. Leo remained safe, and exactly 3 weeks after the breadbasket humiliation, my family's last financial shield was about to be examined from the inside. My father's supply chain logistics company was not just struggling, it was actively bleeding to death. For the past 2 years, he had blindly allowed Spencer to act as the chief operating officer, a role my brother treated like a personal ATM and a convenient excuse to play golf on Tuesday afternoons. Spencer had arrogantly alienated their primary vendors, mismanaged their expensive logistics software, and driven their quarterly revenue into a steep, unrecoverable dive. Their absolute only hope of avoiding complete bankruptcy, mass layoffs, and total liquidation was the pending acquisition by Apex Solutions. They needed my company to buy their failing company. They needed my cash to save their lives and their reputations. I sat at the head of the massive obsidian table in the dark tinted glass conference room on the top floor of Apex headquarters. The Chicago skyline stretched out behind me, a fitting backdrop for the empire I had built entirely on my own. My chief financial officer, Marcus, and my lead corporate counsel, Elena, sat quietly to my right, their tablets glowing in the dim light. We had spent the entire weekend reviewing the forensic audit of my father's company. What we found was so deeply toxic that it almost defied belief. The heavy double doors opened, and Richard walked in, followed closely by Spencer.
They looked entirely different from the arrogant, aggressive men who had tried to kick me out of my own penthouse just 3 weeks ago. Their custom-tailored suits looked slightly too big on them now. Their shoulders were slumped in defeat, and the dark, heavy bags under their eyes told a story of sleepless, panic-filled nights. They knew exactly who they were meeting today. The reality that the daughter they had relentlessly mocked held their entire future in the palm of her hand had finally crushed their fragile egos into dust.
Richard pulled out a chair halfway down the long table, pointedly refusing to meet my eyes directly. Spencer sat next to him, staring intently at the leather portfolio in front of him, chewing nervously on his bottom lip. "Good afternoon, gentlemen," I said, my voice echoing slightly in the vast, quiet room. "I appreciate you coming in to review the final forensic audit before we decide whether to proceed with this acquisition." "Lydia, please," Richard started, his voice cracking with a desperate, gravelly tone that I had never heard from him before. He leaned forward, clasping his hands together tightly. "We are ready to sign the integration paperwork, right now, today. We will accept the initial valuation offer without any further negotiations. You do not even need to retain me on the board of directors. Just push the buyout through. The banks are threatening to call in our commercial loans by Friday. If you do not authorize this buyout, we are going to lose everything." "Apex Solutions does not make blind investments, Richard," I said, keeping my tone entirely clinical and detached. "When we prepare to acquire a struggling asset, we perform a deep tissue analysis of its financial health. We look under every single rock. And unfortunately, your company is not just sick. It is infected with a fatal disease." I slid a single highlighted page across the long obsidian table toward them. The paper stopped perfectly in front of my father. Richard looked down at the document, his brow furrowed in deep confusion. Spencer leaned over to read it, and I watched the exact moment his breathing abruptly stopped. The blood completely drained from my brother's face, leaving him looking like a ghost. "You continuously claimed your massive operational deficit was due to global supply chain disruptions and rising inflation." I continued, my eyes locked on Spencer's terrified face. "But my forensic team found a separate, glaring hole in the seller-authorized ledger. Specifically, the discrepancy sits inside the employee retirement plan. Those assets were held for workers and protected by federal benefits law. According to the reconciled plan records, exactly $3 million has systematically vanished from your employees' retirement accounts over the last 14 months. Richard's head snapped up, his face pale and slack with shock. "What are you talking about? That is impossible. The pension fund is strictly locked. It is managed by an independent third-party financial group. The plan had an outside custodian." I corrected him, pulling up a digital file on my tablet. "Until Spencer took over as chief operating officer and changed payments and inserted a vendor channel that bypassed normal approvals," Spencer Richard whispered, a terrifying edge of realization creeping into his voice. "What did you do?" "I did not do anything," Spencer stammered, his voice pitching high with panic. His eyes darted frantically toward the door. "It is a glitch. Her software is completely wrong. She is just trying to frame us because she hates this family. She is making this up to ruin us." I smiled, a cold, razor-sharp smile, pressing a button on my tablet to project the transaction pathways onto the large digital screen behind me. "Numbers do not hate anyone, Spencer. They preserve what people authorize," I said. "And the truth is, you manually authorized 47 separate wire transfers from the plan-related holding accounts into a false corporate vendor profile. You labeled the outflow as international freight insurance through a path that bypassed the normal review sequence. But that specific vendor does not insure freight. In fact, that vendor does not actually provide any services at all." I clicked to the next slide, revealing the corporate ownership records and a redacted authorization trail and the public ownership filing for the false vendor. "That vendor is a shell company registered in Delaware," I stated, watching my father read the names, brightly illuminated on the screen.
And the registered manager of that shell company is Carter, your polished son-in-law. Richard's jaw dropped open. He looked back and forth between the glowing screen and his trembling son, completely paralyzed by the magnitude of the betrayal playing out in front of him. You and Carter conspired to embezzle $3 million from your own hardworking employees. I continued, laying out the absolute destruction of their lives with surgical precision. Carter used his half of the stolen money to desperately try and cover the massive offshore gambling debts that currently have the investigators reviewing his gambling-related transactions. And you, Spencer, you funneled your half directly into Felicity's personal bank accounts to fund her leased luxury cars, her custom designer gowns, and her entirely fake country club lifestyle. You diverted the retirement savings of warehouse workers and truck drivers just so your sister could pretend she was untouchable social royalty on social media. The display concealed names and numbers while preserving dates. Richard gripped the edge of the table so hard his knuckles turned stark white. He was staring at the undeniable proof that his golden children, the ones he had constantly praised, funded, and protected while treating me like an unwanted burden, were actually federal criminals who had just destroyed his entire lifelong legacy. If Apex closes a conventional merger while ignoring this evidence, the buyer inherits plan liabilities and reporting exposure, I said, closing my folder with a sharp, definitive snap that made Spencer flinch. Apex Solutions is suspending the merger structure and preparing a distress transaction that protects employees and restores the plan.
Lydia, you cannot do this, Richard begged, suddenly standing up, his pride completely shattered into a million pieces. If you suspend the merger now, the company immediately goes into receivership. The independent bankruptcy auditors will find this missing money. Investigators will follow the records. I will lose everything I have ever built. Please, you have to help us cover this up. We are your blood. We are your family. I stood up gracefully, smoothing out the cuffs of my tailored blazer. I looked down at the desperate men who had spent my entire life trying to make me feel small and insignificant. You made it very clear at the steakhouse that I am not part of your family, I said, my voice dropping to a chilling whisper. You explicitly told me I was a broke, single mother who dragged down your prestigious image. You tried to force me onto the street. So no, Richard, I will not cover up a massive benefit plan theft to save your precious golden children. I turned and walked toward the double doors, my heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. I paused just before I exited the conference room, resting my hand on the heavy metal handle. Oh, and Dad? I added, glancing over my shoulder one last time. My legal team is required by our duties to preserve the records, notify the plan administrator, and refer the suspected theft to the Department of Labor's Employee Benefits Security Administration and federal investigators. The verified file is already outside this building. Any attempt to alter records or move collateral will become additional evidence. Use the next 24 hours to find independent counsel. I settled into my ergonomic desk chair and looked out over the Chicago skyline. Less than 10 minutes later, Marcus, my chief financial officer, walked into my office. He was holding his secure tablet, a slight knowing smile playing at the corners of his mouth. We just caught something highly interesting in the automated underwriting queue, Marcus said, placing the tablet directly in front of me. I think you are going to want to personally review this application. I looked at the glowing screen. It was an expedited commercial bridge loan application submitted to Sentinel Capital. Sentinel was a rapid deployment, high-interest digital lending platform. It was designed for corporate entities that needed large, secured facilities on a fast timetable and were willing to pay high rates to get it. What the general public did not know, and what the applicant clearly had no idea about, was that Sentinel Capital was a wholly owned, separately branded subsidiary of Apex Solutions. Apex supplied its capital, but independent credit controls still applied. I read the name on the primary applicant line and let out a soft, genuine laugh. It was Carter.
My brother-in-law was currently drowning in a tidal wave of panic. He knew the federal investigators were already reviewing his offshore gambling accounts because of the Charity Gala disaster. But more urgently, he knew that the Apex Solutions due diligence team were scheduled to review his father-in-law's supply chain company by the end of the week. Carter knew that the second those auditors looked at the books, they would find the $3 million hole in the employee pension fund that he and Spencer had embezzled. He was trapped. His only chance of survival was to somehow secure a $3 million bridge facility, route it through an escrow payment to the plan custodian to replace what he stole, pass the corporate audit, let the acquisition buyout go through, and then use his cut of the merger money to pay off the bridge loan. It was a desperate effort to conceal the history of the shortage, and he had just blindly walked into my digital lobby to ask me to fund it. He requested a 48-hour accelerated closing, Marcus noted, tapping the screen to bring up the collateral inventory. He bypassed the standard corporate review and selected the algorithmic preliminary review tier. To do that for $3 million, he had to put up a massive amount of verified collateral. I scrolled through the itemized list of collateral Carter had desperately offered up to the algorithm. He had pledged his entire independent consulting firm, his remaining drained investment portfolios, and the crown jewel of his artificial empire. He had offered a recorded security interest in his sprawling 6-bedroom suburban mansion. I stared at the property address. It was the exact same mansion Felicity used as the backdrop for her daily social media posts. She constantly flaunted her imported Italian marble kitchen, her custom heated pool, and her pristine manicured lawns to her country club friends, using that house as irrefutable proof that she was superior to me. The title sat in a property company Carter controlled, created after Richard's lavish wedding gift, and the application certified that no undisclosed lien existed. He was now leveraging the roof over his family's head in a blind gamble to avoid a federal prison sentence. He wants to use algorithmic approval because he knows traditional bankers would ask too many questions about why he needs $3 million by tomorrow morning, I said, leaning back in my chair. He thinks a computer is just going to verify his assets and wire the cash. Should I decline the application? Marcus asked, his finger hovering over the red rejection button. I shook my head slowly, my eyes locked on the list of collateral. Absolutely not. If we decline him, he will just panic and try to find another lender. I want him exactly where I can see him. Route it to credit committee, disclose my relationship, and send its recommendation. I will authorize only a council-reviewed facility. I opened the complex smart contract. Carter was right about one thing. He had the physical assets to secure the loan. But as the chief executive officer of the parent conglomerate, I had the authority to approve the stipulations of any high-risk lending agreement after independent review. I opened the Terms of Service section and reviewed the enhanced fraud representations and collateral covenants that counsel had placed prominently in the executive summary. The agreement stated clearly that any material false representation, undisclosed government investigation, or use of the proceeds to conceal earlier financial misconduct would trigger default and acceleration. The funds would move only through controlled escrow to the plan custodian. After a default, Sentinel could enforce its perfected liens through required notices, receivership, and judicial foreclosure. It could not seize a home instantly or erase Carter's right to court review. It was a financial tripwire, but it was not hidden. Carter had already triggered it through the answers in his application, and the warning appeared again beside the electronic signature box. I saved the modified smart contract, attached the approval notification, and pressed send. The secure email was instantly routed directly to Carter's phone. The tracking software showed his digital footprint entering the secure portal. The 30-page legal document loaded onto his screen. Men like Carter do not read the fine print when they are drowning. They only look for the life raft. He saw the green-approved banner and the promise that $3 million would reach the controlled escrow by morning. He did not read the terms. He ignored the fraud stipulation displayed in the summary and signature screen. He did not care about anything except surviving the week. A bright green notification chimed loudly across my quiet office. The system confirmed the action. Carter had scrolled aggressively to the very bottom of the document and applied his biometric electronic signature and repeated every certification. I smiled, locking my screen and standing up from my desk. Carter thought he had just outsmarted the system. He thought he had successfully covered his tracks and saved his family's prestigious image from complete annihilation. He had absolutely no idea that he had just created a second, authenticated record tying himself to the missing money. I did not own his mansion that afternoon. Sentinel held an enforceable lien that would still require lawful notice and court supervision. 2 days later, a courier arrived at the concierge desk of my building. Mr. Davis personally brought a thick, gold-embossed envelope up to my penthouse. I opened it at my kitchen island while reviewing the morning market reports. It was a formal invitation to a corporate gala celebrating the historic acquisition of Richard's supply chain company by Apex Solutions. Right on cue, my phone rang. The caller ID flashed with my father's name. I answered on the second ring, keeping my voice perfectly neutral. The invitation? Yes, it just arrived, I replied. Good. I am expecting you to be there on Saturday night, he commanded, his voice dripping with condescension. I want you to see what real success looks like. I want you to stand in the room while your brother, your sister, and I completely change our lives. Maybe witnessing actual wealth will finally cure you of your pathetic delusions. That is very generous of you, Dad, I said smoothly. There are strict conditions, he continued, completely ignoring my response. Do not bring Leo. This is an elite corporate event, not a daycare for fatherless children. Furthermore, you will wear a plain black dress. I do not want you drawing any attention to yourself. You are going to stand in the back corner of the ballroom and stay completely out of sight. I am meeting the Chief Executive Officer of Apex Solutions that night to sign the final paperwork, and I will not have you embarrassing me in front of a billionaire. Understood, I said, maintaining my flawless composure. Plain black dress, back corner, no Leo. I will be there. I hung up the phone before he could issue any more ridiculous demands. The moment the line disconnected, I tapped the secure speed dial for Marcus, my chief financial officer and public-facing executive proxy. Good morning, Lydia. Marcus answered immediately. Marcus, we have a corporate gala to attend this Saturday, I instructed, pacing across my wide living room. Richard sent me a formal invitation. He genuinely believes he is signing the final acquisition documents in front of Chicago high society. He is entirely mistaken, Marcus noted with a dry chuckle. Carter's false certifications triggered Sentinel's default review. The ordinary merger is paused, but Council has prepared a distressed acquisition conditioned on control transfer and employee protections. I know I smiled, but Richard and Spencer do not know that yet, and Carter is too terrified to confess what he did. I want to make the official announcement in person. Prepare a complete multimedia presentation for my arrival. Use, redacted, seller-authorized audit figures, public filings, and Sentinel's authenticated default record. Have Council approve every slide for the ballroom screens. You want to execute the public reckoning publicly, Marcus asked, sounding thoroughly impressed. For 20 years, my family forced me to serve drinks and wash dishes in the background of their lavish parties, I said, my voice turning ice cold. Richard wants to put on a show to celebrate his fake legacy. I am simply making sure the audience gets a truthful performance. Have the legal team finalize the default notices, lien enforcement papers, and the proposed foreclosure complaint. I want proof of the security interest, not an illegal midnight seizure. Consider it done, Madam CEO, Marcus replied before ending the call. My phone buzzed on the court's counter. A text message from Felicity illuminated the screen. Even on the verge of what she thought was her ultimate triumph, she simply could not resist taking a cheap, petty shot. Make sure you bring a pen and paper on Saturday, Felicity wrote. You might want to take notes on how to be a successful person. Try not to cry when you see our new net worth, you miserable failure. No need for a pen. I already prepared the contract. I placed my phone face down on the quartz counter. My team was not secretly watching personal bank accounts. It was assembling information the family had made public or supplied in transaction files. Event contracts showed a non-refundable exotic car rental. Boutique financing notices attached to Carter's credit application documented new installment purchases. Felicity's own social post displayed the jewelry, the fittings, and the hired Rolls-Royce. They were buying expensive props to impress the CEO of Apex Solutions, unaware that the woman they had ordered into a dark corner was reviewing the liabilities supporting every prop. Their performance was becoming more extravagant at the exact moment their available cash was disappearing. The car company, hotel, and boutique had all extended credit on promises tied to the expected acquisition. Those promises would become claims against the family when the closing terms were revealed. I needed no private surveillance. Their own contracts described the performance. I walked into the living room, where Leo was sitting on the thick rug, carefully assembling a complex architectural Lego set. I sat down next to him, handing him a small gray brick he had been searching for. He looked up at me, his bright eyes full of innocent curiosity. He asked why we were not going to a fancy dinner with his grandparents tonight, since Felicity had loudly bragged about the gala the last time she saw him. I smoothed his hair, looking at his healthy, smiling face, and suddenly felt a cold, phantom chill in my chest. 5 years ago, Leo had not been smiling. He had been lying in a sterile pediatric ward, struggling to breathe through a severe respiratory infection. I was a newly single mother, completely broke, working 3 minimum-wage freelance jobs just to keep the lights on. The hospital required a $500 copay for his specialized breathing treatments and medications before they would even consider discharging him. I had exactly $12 in my checking account. In a state of absolute panic and desperation, I had called my parents. They were vacationing at a luxury 5-star resort in Hawaii, a trip that cost more than my annual rent. When Richard answered the phone, I could clearly hear the sound of a live ukulele band and the clinking of cocktail glasses in the background. I swallowed my pride, crying into the phone, begging him for a $500 loan just to get my sick child the medicine he needed to breathe. Richard did not even consult my mother. He let out a harsh, annoyed sigh, irritated that I was disrupting his tropical vacation vibe. He told me that my financial failures were my own problem. His exact words, burned permanently into my memory, were that if I was capable of giving birth to a child, I needed to figure out how to take care of him myself. He hung up on me. That night I walked through the freezing rain to a downtown pawn shop and sold the only valuable thing I had left, my gold wedding band, for exactly $500 to buy my son's breathing medication. Looking at Leo, now safe and secure in our penthouse, I smiled. "We do not need to go to their dinner, sweetheart," I told him gently. "True wealth is not about showing off fancy cars or wearing expensive jewelry for strangers. True wealth is having the power to protect the people you love. And tonight, Mommy has to go to work to make sure nobody can ever hurt us again." While I was sitting on the floor playing with Legos, a secure courier was pulling into the circular driveway of Richard's suburban estate. The courier was carrying a heavy, sealed envelope stamped with the official insignia of the Apex Solutions legal department. Richard practically ripped the door open himself, signing for the package with trembling hands. Inside the envelope was a thick stack of legal documents and a cover letter drafted by Apex's lead corporate counsel. The letter officially explained the proposed distressed acquisition and the conditions required to keep the company operating. It congratulated Richard on the upcoming historic merger and stated that any purchase consideration would first satisfy secured lenders, restore the employee plan, and fund working capital before shareholders received anything. The conditions were written plainly, but greed made them invisible. The letter explicitly stated that before closing, the shareholders and guarantors had to execute the stock purchase agreement, voting proxies releases, and control transfer documents. The contract demanded the transfer of the controlling shares and voting authority to Apex Solutions, subject to escrow creditor approval and the plan restoration schedule. It required the signatures of every family member who held shares, guarantees, or beneficiary rights. Richard, Patricia, Spencer, Felicity, and Carter. Richard received a link to the full data room and written advice to obtain independent counsel. He ignored both and skimmed only the projected closing value. He was a man completely blinded by greed, drowning in debt, and salivating at the thought of hundreds of millions of dollars arriving in his bank account by midnight. He summoned the entire family to his home office. They gathered around his heavy mahogany desk like starving animals looking at a feast. Carter signed the papers first, his hands shaking, desperate to finalize the deal so he could use the merger money to cover the $3 million bridge facility he had taken from Sentinel. Spencer signed next, sweating profusely, believing this payout would magically erase the retirement plan shortage he had helped conceal from the employee pension fund. Felicity and Patricia signed with arrogant smirks, already imagining the private jets and designer wardrobes they would buy after closing. Finally, Richard scrawled his signature across the bottom line, proudly handing the entire stack of documents back to the waiting courier. They genuinely believed they were signing their tickets to the Billionaire Boys Club. They had absolutely no idea they had just transferred the controlling shares, voting proxies, and executive authority described in the agreement, placing control directly to the daughter they had just commanded to wear a plain black dress and hide in the shadows. 2 hours later, Apex's public-facing executive walked into my penthouse living room. He was holding the original, freshly signed contracts. He placed them gently on my kitchen island, a controlled smile on his face. "The closing conditions are satisfied," the executive said. "The signed proxies place voting control with Apex, and the stock transfer will release from escrow when the plan restoration funds and lender consents are confirmed." They had the opportunity to obtain counsel. They chose speed. I looked down at the signatures on the closing package. The men and women who had starved me, humiliated my son, and tried to destroy my sanity had just willingly handed me the authority to protect the employees and remove the people who had created the crisis. I walked into my bedroom and opened the closet. The plain black dress Richard had ordered me to wear hung at the front like a final command from a man who no longer controlled anything. I moved it aside and selected a custom sapphire gown with sharp architectural lines. I added diamond cuffs, swept my hair back, and studied the woman in the mirror. I would not hide at the gala, and I would not pretend that the transaction was something it was not. "It is time to go to the party," I told the executive as I returned to the living room. "Let us give them the complete terms of the agreement they signed." The grand ballroom of the Ritz-Carlton was a blinding display of manufactured triumph. I stepped out of my chauffeured town car, the cool evening breeze catching the heavy silk of my dress, and handed my invitation to the white-gloved attendant at the door. Inside the space was drowning in excessive floral arrangements and towering ice sculptures. A classical string quartet played elegantly from a raised mahogany dais, struggling to be heard over the loud, self-important laughter of Chicago's corporate elite. From my vantage point, at the top of the sweeping marble staircase, I had a perfect tactical view of the entire room. My family had positioned themselves exactly where the lighting was most flattering, holding court near the center bar. Richard was aggressively shaking hands with local bank executives, his chest puffed out, speaking at a volume designed to ensure everyone within a 50-foot radius knew he was about to become a very rich man. Patricia stood dutifully at his side, heavily burdened by the diamond necklace she had undoubtedly purchased on a predatory installment plan just hours earlier. Spencer was busy failing to network with venture capitalists looking sweaty and desperate in a suit that did not fit properly.
And then there was Felicity.
She was holding a flute of vintage champagne, posing for a society photographer while draped over her husband, Carter. Carter looked entirely terrified, his eyes darting toward the exits every few seconds, clearly waiting for the federal authorities to drop the hammer on his fraudulent bridge loan. But Felicity was in her absolute element. She thrived on borrowed glory. Growing up, whenever I won an academic award, Felicity would throw a tantrum until our parents bought her a new car to soothe her anxiety. She had spent her entire existence demanding the spotlight, and tonight was supposed to be her ultimate coronation as corporate royalty.
I did not wear black.
I descended the grand staircase wearing a custom-tailored, floor-length haute couture gown in a vibrant, commanding shade of sapphire blue. The bodice was structured with sharp architectural lines that radiated absolute power, while the silk skirt flowed like liquid glass with every step I took. I wore no necklace, allowing the striking neckline of the dress to speak for itself, but my wrists were adorned with a pair of flawless, unborrowed diamond cuffs. As my heels clicked rhythmically against the marble steps, a strange phenomenon occurred. The conversation at the base of the staircase began to falter. The silence spread outward like a ripple in a pond. Heads turned. Businessmen who had previously ignored me suddenly stopped mid-sentence, their eyes tracking my descent with undisguised awe and curiosity. Even the string quartet seemed to lose their tempo for a fraction of a second. It took exactly 10 seconds for Felicity to notice the shift in the room's attention. I watched her perfectly manicured smile turn brittle, then completely shatter as her eyes locked onto mine. The color drained from her face, instantly replaced by a dark, ugly flush of pure rage. She shoved her champagne glass into Carter's chest and marched across the ballroom floor, her heels striking the hardwood like rapid gunfire.
Are you completely out of your mind?
Felicity hissed, her voice vibrating with venom, though she kept her volume low to avoid making a public scene.
What are you wearing?
Dad gave you a direct order to wear black and stay out of sight. I looked down at her, maintaining an expression of absolute terrifying serenity. I decided black did not suit my mood tonight, Felicity. She grabbed my arm, her manicured nails digging into my skin. Who paid for this dress? She demanded, her eyes raking over the expensive silk with naked jealousy. Did you rent it? Did you steal another corporate credit card? You look like a desperate gold digger trying to crash a high society event. You are going to ruin everything. Go to the bathroom, take this off, and leave through the service exit before Dad sees you.
Take your hand off me,
I said. I did not raise my voice, but the sudden freezing drop in my tone made her snatch her hand back as if she had been burned. Richard had finally spotted the commotion. He excused himself from a group of investors and stormed over to us, his face dark with fury. Patricia trailed right behind him, wringing her hands nervously.
Lydia, what is the meaning of this?
Richard growled, stepping so close I could smell the expensive scotch on his breath. I told you to stand in the corner. The chief executive of Apex Solutions is going to walk through those doors any minute to finalize this merger. I will not have my ungrateful failure of a daughter drawing attention to herself and ruining the biggest deal of my life. Security will throw you out right now if you do not step back into the shadows. You really should listen to him, Patricia added, her voice laced with that familiar, condescending pity. You are embarrassing yourself, sweetie. You do not belong in clothes like that. Let your sister have her moment. I smoothed a microscopic wrinkle from my silk skirt, completely unfazed by their unified attack. You seem very stressed for a man who is about to become a billionaire, Richard. Are you worried the buyer might find out about the $3 million Spencer stole from the employee pension fund? Richard choked on his breath, his eyes widening in absolute terror. Felicity looked confused, entirely unaware of the massive embezzlement her father and brother had engaged in to fund her lifestyle. Before Richard could formulate a lie to shut me up, a sudden, heavy hush fell over the entire entrance of the ballroom. The heavy oak double doors swung open, and a towering, distinguished man with silver hair and a sharply tailored tuxedo walked into the room. He was surrounded by a small entourage of security personnel and executive assistants. A collective gasp echoed through the crowd. I heard whispers spreading like wildfire. It is Victor Vance, the founder of Vanguard Innovations. Victor Vance was a legendary tech titan, a man whose net worth eclipsed the gross domestic product of several small countries. He was notoriously reclusive, rarely attending public galas, and his presence alone was enough to make the local executives weak in the knees. Richard had spent the last decade practically begging for a mere 5-minute meeting with Victor, desperately trying to secure a supply chain contract with Vanguard, only to be repeatedly ignored. Richard's face lit up with greedy, desperate hope. He quickly adjusted his tie, completely forgetting his anger toward me. My God, Victor Vance is here. He must have heard about the merger. He is coming to congratulate me. Felicity immediately stood taller, tossing her hair over her shoulder and slapping on her most seductive, camera-ready smile. "Let me handle him, Dad," she whispered confidently. "I know exactly how to charm these tech billionaires." Victor Vance was walking with purposeful, direct strides straight toward our small group. Felicity stepped forward, blocking my view, extending her hand with a sickeningly sweet expression. "Mr. Vance, what an absolute honor. I am Felicity, the daughter of the future owner of Apex Solutions," she purred, batting her eyelashes. "We are so thrilled you could join our family celebration." Victor Vance did not slow his pace. He did not extend his hand. He did not even look at Felicity's face. He walked right past her as if she were nothing more than a poorly placed piece of furniture, forcing her to stumble awkwardly out of his way to avoid being trampled by his security detail. The legendary billionaire stopped exactly 2 feet in front of me. The entire ballroom held its collective breath. You could hear a pin drop. Victor Vance, a man who answered to presidents and prime ministers, offered me a warm, genuine smile. He reached out, gently took my right hand, and bowed his head respectfully, pressing a brief, aristocratic kiss to my knuckles. "Good evening, Madam CEO," Victor said, his deep, resonant voice carrying effortlessly across the silent ballroom. "You look absolutely stunning tonight. I brought the finalized partnership contracts you requested for the new European expansion." I squeezed Victor's hand warmly, ignoring the absolute meltdown happening to my left. "It is wonderful to see you, Victor," I replied, my voice steady and commanding. "Thank you for flying all the way from London. We have a lot of profitable ground to cover tonight." Felicity let out a strangled, high-pitched noise. She looked between me and the billionaire tech titan, her brain completely misfiring as it tried to process the impossible reality unfolding before her eyes. "Madam CEO," she stammered, her voice cracking violently. "What are you talking about? She does data entry. She is a broke, single mother." "I do not know who you are, young lady," Victor said, his tone dripping with absolute authority. "But the woman standing before you is Lydia, the founder, chief executive, and sole voting shareholder of Apex Solutions. She is the architect of one of the most sophisticated financial technology networks in the country. She is a titan of industry, and quite frankly, judging by your profound lack of manners, she is entitled to far more respect than you have shown her." The silence that followed was absolute. Richard's face turned an alarming shade of gray, his knees visibly buckling as the horrifying truth finally crashed down upon him. The massive East Coast conglomerate, he had blindly surrendered his entire failing company to the billionaire chief executive he had been terrified of embarrassing himself in front of. The entity that now held total, irrevocable control over his legacy, his finances, and his freedom. It was all me. I smiled gently at my father, the sapphire silk of my dress catching the light of 100 crystal chandeliers. I told you I had the contract prepared, Dad. Now, if you will excuse me, my guests have arrived, and I have a company to liquidate. Before Richard could demand an explanation, the classical string quartet abruptly stopped playing. The heavy, booming voice of the event coordinator echoed over the state-of-the-art sound system, requesting the attention of all guests. It was time for the main event. It was time for the ceremonial signing of the historic merger. Richard physically shook his head, blinking rapidly as if waking up from a trance. He aggressively adjusted his silk tie plastered on his highly practiced corporate smile, and marched toward the main stage. He completely ignored Victor Vance. He completely ignored me. He was a man walking to the gallows, fully convinced he was walking to a golden throne. Patricia quickly scurried to a front-row table reserved for the family, pulling a completely dazed Felicity and a sweating Spencer along with her. Carter was looking frantically at the exit doors, clearly calculating if he could escape before the federal authorities arrived to audit his fraudulent bridge loan. They sat down, staring blankly ahead, desperately hoping the nightmare they just experienced in the foyer was just a temporary misunderstanding. Richard stepped up to the clear acrylic podium. The bright stage lights illuminated his face, hiding the subtle, terrified sheen of sweat on his forehead. He gripped the edges of the podium and looked out at the sea of wealthy investors, bankers, and Chicago elite.
Thank you all for being here tonight, Richard began, his voice booming through the speakers with unearned authority.
Tonight is a historic milestone. For decades, I have poured my blood, sweat, and tears into building Wilson's supply chain logistics from the ground up. I have created a legacy of excellence, a towering pillar of industry right here in the Midwest, built on absolute integrity and financial transparency. This company has always been a family endeavor, Richard continued, his voice swelling with manufactured emotion. He gestured grandly toward the front row. I want to publicly thank my beautiful wife, Patricia, for standing by my side, and I want to acknowledge my son, Spencer, my brilliant daughter, Felicity, and her highly successful husband, Carter. They are the future of this empire. They are the next generation who will carry my vision forward into the next century. He did not mention my name. Even now, standing on the precipice of a massive corporate buyout, his ultimate instinct was to erase my existence. I smiled into my water glass. It was the perfect setup. But a legacy cannot remain stagnant, Richard declared, gripping the microphone confidently. To secure our future and protect our hardworking employees, we must embrace innovation. That is why tonight, we are officially finalizing a historic acquisition. We are merging our vast logistical empire with the most powerful financial technology conglomerate on the East Coast. This merger proves that our business model is flawless. It proves that our family stands at the absolute pinnacle of corporate success. Polite applause rippled through the ballroom. Richard soaked it up, puffing his chest out proudly. He motioned to a sleek mahogany table set up on the right side of the stage. On the table sat a leather binder containing the final ceremonial integration contracts. It is my profound honor, Richard announced, his voice reaching a crescendo to invite the buyer to the stage. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the mysterious founder, the brilliant architect, and the chief executive officer of Apex Solutions. The audience clapped enthusiastically, turning their heads toward the back of the room, expecting a middle-aged tech billionaire from New York to walk down the center aisle. The main ballroom lights immediately dimmed to a dramatic low level. The stage crew, operating strictly under the instructions my executive team had provided earlier that afternoon, activated a single, massive, blinding white spotlight. The beam of light did not sweep toward the back doors. It snapped directly onto the center VIP table. It landed squarely, flawlessly, and undeniably on me. The applause faltered, then died completely. A wave of absolute, suffocating silence crashed over the room. Hundreds of eyes locked onto the woman in the sapphire blue haute couture gown, sitting calmly under the intense, blazing spotlight. I placed my water glass down on the crisp white tablecloth. I slowly stood up. My name is Lydia, and for 34 years, my family conditioned me to believe I was worthless. They told me to hide in the shadows, to wear cheap clothes, and to apologize for taking up space. Tonight, I was taking up the entire room. I stepped out from behind the table. Marcus and Elena stood up, respectfully falling into step precisely 2 paces behind me. I walked toward the stage. The silence in the ballroom was so absolute, so profoundly heavy, that the only sound was the sharp, rhythmic clicking of my heels against the polished hardwood floor. I stepped onto the brightly lit stage and walked directly toward the acrylic podium. Richard was completely frozen. His hands were locked onto the sides of the podium in a death grip. The color had violently drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. His jaw trembled. He looked at my designer dress, my diamond cuffs, and the 2 high-powered corporate executives standing behind me. The delusion had finally shattered. Reality was crushing his lungs.
"What are you doing?" Richard whispered frantically, leaning into the microphone so only I could hear him. His voice was a pathetic, raspy hiss. "Get off this stage right now. You are ruining everything. Security! Where is the security guard? Remove her immediately!" Before Richard could summon a guard, Elena stepped forward.
My lead corporate counsel possessed a commanding, lethal presence. She effortlessly brushed past Richard, forcing him to stumble awkwardly to the side to avoid being knocked over. Elena gripped the microphone and adjusted it upward.
"Good evening, distinguished guests," Elena said, her crisp, authoritative voice echoing through the massive ballroom.
Allow me to clear up any confusion regarding the executive structure of the acquiring conglomerate. It is my distinct privilege to formally introduce the founder, the sole majority shareholder, and the absolute chief executive officer of Apex Solutions. Elena turned toward me, extending her hand in a gesture of profound respect. Please welcome Miss Lydia. The silence held for one more agonizing second before a massive, deafening wave of applause erupted from the audience of investors and tech executives who recognized the legendary name. The camera flashes from the society photographers went off like strobe lights, capturing the exact moment my father realized his entire life was over. I stepped up to the clear acrylic podium, resting my hands lightly on the polished edges. The microphone hummed as I adjusted it to my height. To my right, Richard looked like a man who had just stepped off a cliff, but had not yet hit the ground. His mouth opened and closed, attempting to form words, but his vocal cords had completely abandoned him. Down in the front row, my family sat frozen in a horrifying tableau. Felicity was clutching Carter's arm so tightly her perfectly manicured nails were likely drawing blood. Carter himself was sweating profusely, his eyes darting frantically toward the heavy oak exit doors. He knew the federal auditors were closing in, and the one financial lifeline he thought he had just turned out to be the executioner. I offered a polite, practiced smile to the audience of Chicago's corporate elite. Without breaking eye contact with the crowd, I pressed a discreet button on the authorized presentation console beneath the podium. The massive digital screens behind me, which had previously displayed the festive combined logos of our 2 companies, suddenly flickered. The image shifted instantly, projecting the high-resolution scans of the integration agreements Richard and his golden children had eagerly signed in their home office just 24 hours ago. My signature sat at the very bottom counter, signed with the absolute, undeniable authority of Apex Solutions. "Thank you, Richard, for that incredibly generous introduction," I said. My voice echoed through the grand ballroom, steady, melodic, and completely terrifying. "And thank you to everyone here tonight for joining us to witness this historic transition in leadership." Richard was absolutely correct about one thing. Wilson Supply Chain Logistics is indeed entering a new era. Apex Solutions has acquired the company in its entirety. Polite, confused applause rippled through the back of the room. However, the front tables, the ones filled with sharp bankers, venture capitalists, and investors who knew exactly how to read the fine print currently projected on the massive screens, remained dead silent. They were reading the clauses. They were realizing what had actually happened. However, I continued my tone, shifting from corporate pleasantry to absolute ice. "There seems to be a fundamental miscommunication regarding the legal structure of this transaction. Richard has been proudly describing this event as a merger of equals, a beautiful blending of legacies to secure his family's future. I assure you it is nothing of the sort." I looked directly down at my brother Spencer. He was visibly shaking in his expensive chair, his skin shining with a cold, panicked sweat. "What we have executed tonight is a distressed control acquisition, the kind of transaction the market calls a hostile takeover when existing management loses the company it tried to save." The words struck the room like physical blows. A collective gasp echoed from the VIP tables. The society photographers, sensing the sudden shift in atmosphere, began snapping photos frantically, their camera flashes illuminating the absolute destruction of my father's ego. "With the binding agreements signed blindly by the entire executive board last evening," I explained, keeping my gaze locked on my family, "the controlling shares and signed voting proxies have transferred to Apex through the closing escrow, subject to creditor consents, and the employee plan restoration schedule. You did not secure a partnership, Richard. You signed away control after declining independent counsel. As of midnight tonight, Wilson Supply Chain Logistics ceases to exist as an independent entity. It is now a controlled subsidiary of Apex Solutions and, as the sole owner and chairwoman of this conglomerate, I possess the absolute legal authority to restructure the leadership exactly as I see fit." Richard finally found his voice. He lunged toward the podium, his face contorted in sheer panic. "You cannot do this!" he hissed, his voice raspy and desperate, loud enough for the front rows to hear. "We are your family! I am your father! You owe me this company!" I did not flinch. I simply stepped to the side as Elena, my lead corporate counsel, moved smoothly to intercept him. She stepped between us and signaled hotel security to keep him away from the microphone. "My first official act as chairwoman is to appoint the interim board named in the closing documents I announced. That board has reviewed the audit and voted to terminate Richard and Spencer for cause, effective immediately, because their management endangered the company and its employees." Spencer let out a pathetic, high-pitched noise, burying his face in his hands as the reality of his situation crushed him. He had spent his entire life bullying me, believing he was the untouchable heir to an empire. Now, he was just an unemployed liability. "You do not get to walk away with a massive golden parachute after driving a decades-old company into the ground," I continued, my voice ringing with righteous authority across the silent ballroom. "You are not retiring with honor. You are being terminated for gross mismanagement, catastrophic negligence, and breaches of your fiduciary duties to your hard-working employees." I gestured toward the back of the grand hall. At my signal, 6 broad-shouldered private security contractors in dark suits stepped forward. They moved swiftly and silently down the center aisle, their presence immediately commanding compliance. Please hand your corporate key cards, your company phones, and your access fobs to the security team right now, I instructed my father and brother. You will be escorted off the premises immediately. Your credentials are disabled, now. Any later access attempt will be logged, preserved, and referred to counsel or law enforcement according to the facts. The ballroom erupted into absolute chaos. Reporters shouted questions, while investors called their legal teams. Spencer was openly weeping, struggling weakly as a security guard placed a firm, uncompromising hand on his shoulder. Richard clutched his chest, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The man who had spent 34 years treating me like garbage was currently having his entire legacy reduced to ashes in front of the exact people he had spent his life trying to impress. Suddenly, a piercing shriek cut through the overwhelming noise of the ballroom. Patricia leaped up from her front row seat, knocking her heavy dining chair backward onto the hardwood floor with a loud crack. Her face was contorted with a kind of unhinged madness I had never seen before. She pointed a trembling diamond-covered finger up at the stage, completely abandoning her carefully crafted high society persona. "You are a monster!" Patricia screamed, her voice cracking with pure hysteria. "You ungrateful, psychotic brat! We gave you everything, and this is how you repay us? How dare you do this to your own flesh and blood? You are trying to steal your brother's assets. You are trying to leave your family with nothing. You planned this whole evil scheme just to rob us blind." The entire room fell dead silent again, captivated by the raw, unfiltered family drama exploding in real time. The elite guests turned their attention from the disgraced father on the stage to the screaming mother on the floor. For 20 years, I had washed their dishes, taken their insults, and endured their deliberate cruelty while they pretended to be royalty. They had never given me anything but grief. I did not react to her insults. I did not raise my voice to match her desperate hysteria. I simply leaned a fraction of an inch closer to the microphone, letting a cold, highly amused smile touch my lips. Assets, I asked my voice, carrying effortlessly over the stunned, breathless crowd. The word hung in the air, heavy and loaded with legal implications. I slowly raised a single eyebrow, locking my gaze directly with my mother's furious eyes. "Is that what you call it, Mom? Because my forensic accountants ran a full audit, and they found the exact opposite. Are you referring to the company assets, or do you mean the $3 million embezzled debt they just pocketed?" Patricia froze. Her outstretched arm slowly dropped to her side as the words registered in her perfectly styled head. She turned her frantic gaze toward Richard, then toward Spencer, silently begging them to scream that I was lying. Neither of them could look her in the eye. Spencer was staring a hole into the hardwood floor, his face the color of spoiled milk. Richard was still clutching his chest, completely paralyzed by the realization that his financial crimes were now public knowledge. I did not give them a single moment to breathe or formulate a lie. I pressed the small black clicker in my right hand. The massive digital screens behind me transitioned instantly. The densely worded integration contracts vanished, replaced by a council-approved, redacted summary of the forensic audit. A collective gasp rolled through the grand ballroom. The wealthy investors in the front rows leaned forward, their eyes scanning the documents. I had projected the verified findings without displaying employee names or account numbers for the entire city of Chicago to witness. There were a transaction map showing plan-related funds moving through the Carter-controlled Delaware vendor. Next to those logs were seller-produced expense records and public lien filings. The statements were highlighted in bright, undeniable crimson. They detailed spending tied to at high-end boutiques, luxury car dealerships, and exclusive European resorts. I turned my attention to the center VIP table, locking my eyes directly with my sister. Felicity was staring up at the massive screens, her jaw hanging slack. The color had completely drained from her face, leaving her heavy, flawless makeup looking like a cheap mask painted on a corpse. "You always had incredibly expensive taste, Felicity," I said, my voice echoing through the silent room with absolute clarity. I gestured toward the screen, and the entire audience followed my hand. "It takes a certain kind of audacity to dine at a Michelin-starred restaurant 3 nights a week while your father is drowning in corporate debt." Felicity jumped to her feet, her heavy dining chair crashing backward onto the polished floor. "Those are fake!" she screamed, her voice shrill and panicked, echoing with desperate denial. She pointed a trembling finger at the screen, her diamond bracelets catching the harsh stage light. "Carter makes an absolute fortune. We are wealthy. You hacked our accounts. You are framing us because you are jealous." I pressed the clicker again. A new slide appeared, dominating the screens. It was a side-by-side comparison. On the left was a photograph Felicity had posted to her social media accounts just last month, proudly showing off a rare, limited edition designer bag while sipping champagne on a yacht. On the right was the exact receipt for that bag, matched perfectly, with a redacted audit entry tracing the purchase to the Carter-controlled vendor, funded by diverted plan money. "No," I corrected her calmly, the microphone amplifying the absolute freezing coldness in my tone. "Carter does not make a fortune. Carter is an unemployed fraud who has not closed a legitimate real estate deal in 3 years. You are not wealthy, Felicity. You are parasites." I walked to the very edge of the stage, looking down at her trembling, pathetic form. "The lifestyle that let you pre-order $380 steaks while denying Leo a meal. The custom-imported Italian marble you installed in your grand foyer. The designer bags you constantly flaunted in my face to prove how much better you were than me. It was not supported by legitimate Carter income." I swept my gaze across the entire ballroom, making sure the press, the investors, and the tech billionaires heard every single syllable. "The audit shows that the designer purchases and household expenses were subsidized with money diverted from the retirement savings of the warehouse workers and delivery drivers who broke their backs for decades building this company. Spencer and Carter endangered the futures of hundreds of innocent, working-class families just so you could pretend to be corporate royalty on the internet." The ballroom erupted into a low, vicious murmur. The business elite of Chicago were ruthless, but they despised messy public liabilities. The bankers who had been shaking Richard's hand just an hour ago were now actively stepping backward, physically distancing themselves from the toxic fallout unfolding before them. No one wanted to be caught in the blast radius of a federal embezzlement scandal. Carter finally panicked. The illusion of his success had been entirely vaporized. He let go of Felicity's hand and bolted. He scrambled over the fallen dining chair, shoving violently past a waiter holding a tray of champagne glasses, making a desperate, pathetic dash toward the main exit doors at the back of the ballroom. I did not even blink. I simply nodded at Marcus. The heavy oak doors opened before Carter reached them. FBI agents entered with investigators from the Department of Labor and IRS Criminal Investigation. The arrest team carried a court-approved warrant. The civil benefit plan investigators remained behind to preserve records and identify victims. "You really should have read the fine print on that bridge loan you took out, Carter One," announced smoothly, as the federal agents firmly grabbed his arms and forced his hands behind his back. "The Sentinel facility from which you borrowed $3 million to cover your catastrophic offshore gambling debts is a wholly owned subsidiary of Apex Solutions, and because you used fraudulent collateral to secure that loan, you triggered an authenticated default record that investigators obtained through lawful process." Carter went limp as the agents arrested him on the warrant for conspiracy wire fraud and theft from an employee benefit plan. The loan default did not create the criminal charges by itself. It supplied corroborating records, false certifications, and the controlled escrow trail. Felicity let out a blood-curdling shriek as she watched her husband being dragged away by federal authorities. She spun back toward me, her eyes wild, her perfect socialite facade entirely annihilated. "You cannot do this to me!" she wailed, tears carving thick black tracks of mascara down her cheeks. "My house, my reputation. We have a mortgage. We are an established family. You are destroying my entire life." I pressed the clicker one final time. The screens behind me flashed a brilliant warning red, displaying a massive, unmistakable notice of default recorded lien and a foreclosure complaint prepared for filing. "There is one more consequence," I said. "Carter pledged the property company that holds your mansion and falsely certified the purpose of the Sentinel loan. The lender has accelerated the debt. Tomorrow, counsel will serve the required notices and file for judicial foreclosure and a receiver. No sheriff is taking your home at sunrise, but the process that can remove it from you has legally begun." The absolute finality of my words struck her like a physical blow. The reality of her total destruction finally pierced through her blinding delusion. Her accounts were restricted, and the house had become collateral in a court-supervised enforcement case. Her husband was in federal custody. Her father was stripped of his company and facing prison time. She was completely, utterly ruined. Felicity's knees buckled beneath her. She collapsed onto the hardwood floor of the Ritz-Carlton ballroom, landing squarely in a puddle of spilled champagne. The heavy, expensive silk of her borrowed designer gown soaked up the sticky alcohol, ruining the fabric instantly. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders heaving with ugly, desperate sobs. Above the sound of her weeping, a terrifying new noise filled the room. It was the sound of 100 camera shutters clicking in rapid succession. The society photographers, sensing the greatest corporate scandal of the decade, surged forward, their bright flashes exploding like lightning across the dark room. They ruthlessly captured every angle of her humiliation. The golden child of the Wilson family, sobbing on her knees in a puddle of spilled alcohol, surrounded by the undeniable evidence of her crimes. The elite guests did not offer her a single ounce of pity. The room buzzed with contemptuous whispers. Women who had praised Felicity's dress an hour earlier were now looking at her with undisguised disgust. Men who had sought her father's favor were already deleting his number from their phones and turning their backs. I stood on the brightly lit stage, looking down at the smoking crater of my former family. The plain black dress my father had ordered me to wear was hanging forgotten in my closet, while the sapphire silk of my custom gown radiated absolute, unquestionable power. I had given them exactly what they had earned. I stood by the expansive floor-to-ceiling windows of my private executive suite on the 50th floor, watching the early morning sun break over the sprawling Chicago skyline. The city looked clean, sharp, and entirely new. My office, a modern masterpiece of polished steel, dark mahogany, and soundproof glass, reflected the absolute, undeniable control I now possessed over everything my father had once claimed to own. Marcus stood quietly by the heavy double doors, holding a silver tray with a single cup of black coffee. He checked his watch with mechanical precision. It was exactly 7 in the morning. The heavy doors swung open, and my private security team escorted my biological family inside. They did not look like the elite corporate royalty who had strutted arrogantly into the Ritz-Carlton ballroom just 12 hours earlier. They looked like desperate refugees fleeing a war zone they had entirely brought upon themselves. Richard was wearing the exact same suit from the gala, but his expensive silk tie was missing, and his shirt was severely wrinkled and stained with sweat. His face was a sickly, terrifying shade of gray. Spencer was physically shaking, his bloodshot eyes darting around my massive office like a trapped, panicked animal. Felicity looked absolutely ruined. Her borrowed haute couture gown was torn at the hem, her face was streaked with thick, dried mascara, and her hands were trembling violently. Patricia walked in last, clutching her designer purse against her chest like a useless shield, her eyes red and swollen from a night of endless weeping. Carter was noticeably absent, currently sitting in a cold federal holding cell, waiting for his arraignment on massive offshore fraud charges. I took a slow sip of my coffee, savoring the bitter, rich taste, and turned to face the people who had spent my entire life trying to systematically destroy my sanity. Richard stepped forward first. The overbearing arrogance that had defined his entire existence had completely evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, terrified shell of a man. His knees visibly buckled, and he collapsed onto the floor. A man who had spent 34 years demanding total submission from me was now weeping on my imported Persian rug. "Lydia, please," Richard begged, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched sob. "You have taken the company, you have taken the legacy, you have taken everything I ever built. Just let me keep my pension account. Let me keep the suburban house. I will do whatever you want. I will work in the warehouse. I will mop the floors. Just do not send the federal auditors after me. I cannot survive federal prison." Spencer immediately dropped to his knees right beside our father, his pride entirely shattered. "I am sorry," Lydia Spencer cried out, his voice thick with panic. "I am so sorry for every cruel thing I ever said to you. I will pay back the $3 million. I will get a minimum wage job. Just call off the forensic accountants. The federal investigators were waiting outside my apartment complex at dawn. Please, you are my sister. You have to save me." Felicity could not even formulate words. She just wailed a loud, ugly, desperate sound, echoing off the pristine glass walls of my office. She had lost her fraudulent husband, her foreclosed mansion, and her unearned social standing in a single devastating night. She was entirely broken, stripped of the borrowed privilege that had fueled her cruelty for decades. Patricia, however, refused to kneel. She walked up to my heavy quartz desk, her face contorted with a desperate, calculating kind of panic. She realized that intimidation had completely failed, so she instantly pivoted to the only weapon she thought she had left. She tried to deploy emotional manipulation. "Lydia, sweetheart, look at what you are doing to us," Patricia pleaded, forcing a trembling, maternal smile that made my stomach turn. "This is not who you are. You are a good, gentle, forgiving person. We are your family. We are your own flesh and blood. You are angry and you have every right to be upset about the past, but you cannot destroy us like this." I placed my coffee cup down on the desk, saying absolutely nothing, letting her dig her own grave with every manipulative word. Think about little Leo Patricia cried, pressing both hands to her chest in a theatrical display of grandmotherly concern. He loves his family. He needs his grandparents. He needs his uncles and his aunt to be part of his life. You cannot tear this family apart and leave him isolated. How will you explain to your innocent son that you sent his grandfather to a maximum security prison? How will you explain that you left his family starving on the street? Do it for Leo, Lydia. Have some human mercy for the sake of your child. The silence in the executive office was sudden and deafening. I looked at Patricia, feeling an absolute freezing rage completely consume every nerve in my body. I raised my hands and slammed them flat onto the heavy quartz desk. The sound cracked through the room like a gunshot. Patricia physically jumped backward, her fake trembling smile vanishing instantly. Richard and Spencer flinched violently on the floor, shrinking away from my desk. "Do not you ever dare speak my son's name," I commanded. My voice dropped to a lethal, quiet register that commanded absolute, unquestionable authority. "You want to talk about mercy? You want to talk about family? Let us talk about exactly 3 weeks ago." I walked around the desk, my sharp heels clicking rhythmically against the polished hardwood floor, closing the distance between me and the woman who gave birth to me.
3 weeks ago, you summoned me to a high-end downtown steakhouse and allowed Leo to be publicly humiliated, I said, staring directly into Patricia's terrified eyes. You ordered thousands of dollars in premium, dry-aged steaks and vintage champagne, running up a massive bill you fully intended to force your broke single daughter to pay. And when my 8-year-old son, who was hungry and exhausted, politely reached across the table for a single complimentary dinner roll from the breadbasket, what exactly did you do, Richard? Richard squeezed his eyes shut, turning his head away completely, unable to look at me. Felicity pushed a basket of cold bread toward him and said no meal had been ordered. Richard told me I should have packed food from home. Patricia watched, and Spencer laughed. Every adult at that table chose humiliation over feeding an 8-year-old child. You did not choose Leo then. You chose your image and your cruelty. I looked down at Felicity, who was still weeping into the rug, then at Spencer, then at my parents. Family protects each other, I declared coldly. Family does not steal $3 million from the pension funds of hard-working warehouse employees to buy designer handbags and luxury sports cars. Family does not take out fraudulent bridge loans to cover offshore gambling debts. Family does not leave a desperate mother to watch her child suffocate in a hospital bed while they drink cocktails on a beach in Hawaii. You are not my family. You are a collection of greedy parasites who finally picked the wrong host. I turned my back on them, walked behind my desk and opened the top drawer. I pulled out a thick, heavy legal folder prepared by independent civil counsel and stamped with the Apex Solutions insignia. I tossed it carelessly across the smooth surface. It landed with a heavy thud right in front of Patricia. I am offering one civil resolution, I announced. It cannot erase a government investigation, dismiss a federal charge, or guarantee that anyone avoids prison. Those decisions belong to investigators, prosecutors, and judges. What it can do is determine whether Apex spends years pursuing additional civil claims against every person in this room. Richard and Spencer looked up. Their hope was smaller now, because even they understood I could not sell them immunity. The agreement requires full cooperation with the employee plan fiduciary and federal investigators' truthful proffers through independent lawyers' resignation from every company position, waiver of severance, and restitution liens against non-exempt assets traceable to the loss. If you comply, Apex will limit its civil recovery to documented losses, fees, and lawful interest, rather than seek additional punitive damages. Richard reached toward the folder, but I stopped him. Your lawyers are waiting in the adjoining conference room. They will explain every clause. No one signs until counsel confirms that the decision is informed and voluntary. Patricia stared at me. You are still taking everything. I am restoring what your family took from employees, I replied. Bankruptcy exemptions, existing senior liens, and court supervision still apply. I do not get to erase those rules because I am angry. There was one final boundary. The settlement included a no-contact covenant consent to a court-reviewed protection order, covering my home office Leo's school and electronic communications, and an agreement not to use relatives or the press as intermediaries. A private contract could not manufacture a permanent restraining order, so counsel would submit the consent terms to the court. If they violated the order, I would not threaten to fabricate charges. I would document the violation, seek enforcement, and let the existing financial and criminal cases continue on their own evidence. I placed 4 identical copies of the agreement on the desk. You have until noon, I said. Read it with your lawyers, cooperate, restore the plan, and disappear from our lives. Or reject it, and face every civil remedy Apex is entitled to pursue. For the first time, no one shouted. Richard looked at Spencer, Spencer looked at Felicity, and Patricia finally understood that tears could not alter jurisdiction, evidence, or debt. Security escorted them into separate rooms with separate counsel. I stayed at my desk, with the breadbasket image burning behind my eyes, not as a wound,
but as the boundary that made the decision simple. By late morning, each family member had met separately with independent counsel. The lawyers confirmed that the criminal investigation would continue, regardless of the civil agreement, and that Apex was promising no immunity. Richard signed first, surrendering his corporate claims and consenting to restitution liens. Spencer signed a cooperation and proffer agreement. Patricia and Felicity signed the no-contact covenant and releases after their lawyers explained every consequence. No one climbed over anyone else or signed under a 2-minute threat. Their signatures were witness notarized and placed in escrow pending court approval of the restitution and protection provisions. They chose the agreement because the evidence was real and because cooperation was the only rational path left. Each lawyer signed a certificate confirming that the client understood the terms and was acting voluntarily. Marcus stepped forward smoothly, collecting the executed documents and sliding them into a secure leather briefcase. The civil resolution was complete, subject to court review. The separation was final. I instructed my security team to escort them out through the underground service elevator. I did not watch them leave. I simply turned my leather chair around to face the sprawling Chicago skyline, taking another calm sip of my black coffee as the heavy doors clicked shut behind them. The fallout unfolded through legal processes rather than overnight magic. Sentinel served default and acceleration notices, then filed the foreclosure case against the property company holding Felicity's mansion. After months of motions and a court-approved sale process, Felicity surrendered possession and moved into a cramped apartment she once would have mocked. The debts did not automatically become hers merely because Carter was arrested. She remained liable for obligations she had jointly guaranteed and for purchases made through accounts bearing her signature. With her social connections gone and no professional history strong enough to support her former lifestyle, she took gig delivery work and began paying creditors under a supervised plan. Richard and Patricia faced a different yet equally devastating kind of destruction. Richard was not charged with the theft after the evidence showed negligence rather than participation. Spencer's fate remained with federal prosecutors, but his cooperation and restitution were formally documented. Neither man avoided this. A could not avoid the social annihilation that immediately followed the Ritz-Carlton Gala. The Chicago business elite operated on a strict, unforgiving code of success, and they had zero tolerance for messy public failures. When Richard tried to call his former banking colleagues to ask for a small personal loan to secure a decent apartment, his calls were immediately screened and blocked. Men who used to drink his expensive scotch now pretended they had never met him. Patricia attempted to attend her weekly country club luncheon, desperately trying to maintain appearances and pretend the hostile takeover was just a corporate restructuring. The club manager met her in the grand lobby, politely but firmly informing her that her membership had been permanently revoked due to unpaid dues and character clauses. Their wealthy friends crossed the street when they saw them coming. The people who had worshipped their manufactured wealth now treated them like an infectious disease. Stripped of their assets, they were forced to rent a tiny, single-story house in a blue-collar neighborhood they previously would not have even driven through. Patricia was seen trying to pawn her remaining pieces of jewelry, only to discover Richard had already pledged several pieces to cover business losses. I did not hire investigators to follow them indefinitely. Counsel sent one closing report based on public court records, creditor notices, and information required by the settlement. After that, I ended the file. Building security and Leo's school received the court-approved no-contact order, and any future violation would be documented through ordinary security systems. The separation was enforced with the cold, mechanical precision of a surgical strike. I felt absolutely no guilt. I shed no sentimental tears. There was no late-night longing for a family that never truly existed. They had made their deliberately cruel choices over 34 years, and I was simply delivering their final receipts. With the toxic weight of my family completely eradicated from my life, I turned my full, undivided attention to the only person who actually mattered. I pulled Leo out of the school that no longer felt safe after Felicity's smear campaign. I enrolled him in the most prestigious, elite private academy in the Midwest. The campus was a sprawling, ivy-covered estate with state-of-the-art science labs, private equestrian facilities, and incredibly supportive educators. When I walked him through the heavy mahogany doors on his first day, nobody looked at us with condescending pity. The headmaster greeted us with profound respect, shaking Leo's hand warmly and welcoming him to the academy. Leo thrived instantly in this new environment. He joined the Advanced Robotics Club, made brilliant new friends who cared about his mind rather than his clothes, and his genuine, carefree laughter echoed through our penthouse every single evening. I had built a fortress of absolute financial and emotional security around him, ensuring he would never know the freezing cold sting of family rejection that had defined my entire childhood. I had stepped fully into control of my own life. I was no longer the invisible daughter. I was no longer the broke freelancer begging for a $500 loan. I was the absolute architect of my reality, ruling over a financial technology empire that spanned across multiple continents. I spent my days negotiating massive international acquisitions, managing thousands of brilliant employees, and building a legacy that was entirely my own. The plain black dress from the gala remained in the back of the closet, powerless now. My wardrobe now consisted solely of custom-tailored executive suits that radiated unquestionable power and authority. I walked into every room knowing exactly what I was worth, and I never apologized for taking up space again. 6 months after the Ritz-Carlton Gala, I sat at the head of the Apex Solutions boardroom while the final restructuring report loaded onto the screen. The old company had survived. The retirement plan had been restored through escrow insurance recoveries and court-approved asset sales, and the employees had kept their jobs. My secure private executive line rang, flashing a priority green light. I picked up the receiver. It was Apex's lead corporate counsel calling directly from the newly acquired Wilson Logistics headquarters across town. "Madam Chairwoman." The lawyer's crisp voice filled the line. I wanted to deliver the update personally. The 6-month corporate restructuring of the former Wilson supply chain subsidiary is officially finalized. We have entirely liquidated their bloated executive expense accounts, integrated their shipping routes into the Apex artificial intelligence grid, and completely eliminated the massive financial waste your father was hiding for decades. I leaned back in my heavy leather chair, looking out through the floor-to-ceiling glass at the sprawling city. "Excellent work," I replied, my voice perfectly steady. "What are the preliminary quarterly projections looking like, now that the dead weight has been removed?" Elena let out a rare, deeply satisfied laugh that resonated with absolute triumph. "The projections are not preliminary anymore, Lydia. The verified 6-month comparison just cleared accounting. By removing your family's gross incompetence and plugging their logistics company into our proprietary financial network, we have shattered every single internal estimate we drafted. The old company is operating with unprecedented frictionless efficiency. I am looking at the final ledger right now. The restructured subsidiary posted an operating profit increase of 300%. I smiled into the secure receiver, feeling the quiet weight of a result built on repaired systems rather than revenge alone. "Keep up the excellent work, Elena," I replied, my voice steady and commanding. "Dispose of any remaining non-essential assets through the approved process and distribute the promised acquisition bonuses to your integration team. They have certainly earned every single penny." I ended the call and placed my phone face down on the polished expanse of my mahogany boardroom table. The pathetic, crumbling ghost of Richard Wilson's legacy had been completely exorcised. In its place stood a sleek, hyper-efficient, highly profitable machine that answered exclusively to me. That evening, exactly 6 months after the gala, the corporate wars felt distant. The retirement plan was restored, the subsidiary was profitable, and the no-contact order had not been violated. Court filings had closed the civil enforcement phase, and Leo had spent half a year without a single hostile message from the family. A cold November rain polished the Chicago streets as my driver brought Leo and me back to the reserve. We were not returning to prove that I could afford the restaurant. We were returning because Leo had finished his first major robotics competition, and he had chosen the place where a basket of cold bread once taught us exactly who our family was. The moment Leo and I stepped through the heavy brass-studded double doors, the chaotic, freezing noise of the city instantly vanished. It was replaced by the soothing, sophisticated hum of classical jazz and the rich, intoxicating aroma of roasted garlic truffles and seared brown butter. We were not asked for a reservation. The general manager, a remarkably poised man in a sharp-tailored tuxedo, immediately abandoned his post at the front mahogany desk. He walked briskly toward us with a warm, highly respectful smile. "Good evening, Madam Chairwoman. Welcome back, young Master Leo," the manager said, bowing his head gracefully. "It is a pleasure to have you dining with us tonight. Your preferred table in the main dining room is already prepared." Leo walked right beside me, wearing a miniature navy suit. His posture, remarkably straight and confident. He was no longer the anxious, exhausted, hungry child who had been viciously berated for daring to reach toward a breadbasket at a family dinner. He was a recognized VIP, treated with the exact same dignity and respect as the hedge fund managers sitting at the adjacent tables. We were seated at the premier window booth, a sprawling semicircle of tufted ivory leather that offered a stunning panoramic view of the rain-slicked city streets outside. Within moments of us sitting down, the heavy oak doors of the main kitchen swung open. Chef Laurent, a Michelin-starred culinary genius who notoriously refused to leave his kitchen during the dinner rush, walked directly toward our table. He was flanked by two professional assistants carrying a polished wooden carving block and a pristine raw cut of A5 Japanese wagyu beef. The intricate, delicate marbling of the meat resembled a flawless work of fine art. "Madam Lydia, it is an absolute honor to host you and your brilliant son again this evening," Chef Laurent said, his thick French accent adding to the theatricality of the moment. He turned his attention entirely away from me and focused on my 8-year-old son, addressing him with profound professional respect. "Master Leo, tonight I have personally prepared something truly exceptional for you. This is the finest cut of beef available in the city, flown in directly from Kobe just a few hours ago." Leo smiled brightly, his eyes wide with innocent, genuine delight. "Thank you very much, Chef Laurent. It looks absolutely amazing," he replied, his manners impeccable and unforced. The master chef beamed with pride. He pulled a gleaming custom Damascus steel carving knife from his leather roll. Right there at our table, he expertly sliced the wagyu, searing the delicate, paper-thin strips on a smoking hot Himalayan saltstone. The air immediately grew thick with the rich, savory scent of caramelized beef. He plated the masterpiece flawlessly, adding a delicate garnish of microgreens, and placed it gently in front of my son. I sat back against the luxurious ivory leather, taking a slow sip of sparkling water, and simply watched my son eat. The premium wagyu melted effortlessly, and Leo hummed with genuine, unburdened happiness. He eagerly began telling me about the complex robotics project he had successfully completed at his elite private academy that afternoon. I listened to his bright, animated voice, feeling an overwhelming wave of profound peace wash over every single nerve in my body. No one would ever slap his hand away from a dining table again. No one would ever dare tell him he was a financial burden or an inconvenience. I had successfully built an impenetrable fortress of absolute wealth, power, and security around him. I had ensured that his future would be dictated only by his own brilliance, kindness, and ambition,
completely free from the toxic poison of my biological family. As Leo enthusiastically detailed the mechanics of his robot's hydraulic arm, my gaze drifted past his smiling face. I looked out through the pristine floor-to-ceiling soundproof window at the harsh, unforgiving reality of the city outside. The autumn rain had rapidly intensified into a freezing, torrential downpour. Traffic was heavily backed up, with aggressive cars splashing massive waves of icy, muddy water onto the concrete sidewalks. That was when I saw her. A figure on a battered, rented, motorized scooter was aggressively weaving through the dangerous, slow-moving traffic, desperately trying to beat a red light at the intersection. The rider was entirely drenched to the bone. She was wearing a cheap, neon-orange plastic poncho, prominently branded with the logo of a low-tier gig-economy food delivery application. A massive, insulated delivery backpack was strapped awkwardly to her narrow shoulders, constantly throwing her off balance in the heavy wind. She hit a deep hidden pothole near the curb, causing the cheap scooter to skid violently across the wet asphalt. She barely managed to catch herself by slamming her foot into the freezing puddle, but the sudden, violent jolt caused the cheap plastic hood of her neon poncho to fall back. The harsh, glaring light of a nearby street lamp perfectly illuminated her face. It was Felicity, the golden child. The woman who had proudly flaunted designer handbags bought with stolen pension funds. The socialite who had mocked my cheap clothes and aggressively demanded I hide in a dark corner so I would not embarrass her in front of billionaires. Now she was shivering violently in the freezing rain. Her formerly flawless, heavily treated blonde hair was plastered to her skull in wet, dirty, tangled strands. Her heavy makeup was entirely washed away by the storm, revealing deep, dark, exhausted circles under her eyes. She looked incredibly gaunt, overwhelmingly desperate, and completely broken by the reality of her new life. Felicity dragged her heavy scooter onto the sidewalk, shivering uncontrollably as she wiped the muddy rainwater from her eyes. As she looked up to check the street signs to find her delivery destination, her gaze swept across the glowing, luxurious windows of the Reserve. For one single, paralyzing second, her eyes locked perfectly with mine. Time seemed to stop completely. Through the thick, soundproof glass, I watched the absolute crushing weight of reality violently strike my sister. She was standing in the freezing mud, wearing a cheap plastic garbage bag ruined and forgotten. I was sitting in the most exclusive restaurant in the Midwest, draped in custom designer silk, dining on imported Kobe beef, an absolute titan in a world she had been permanently and ruthlessly expelled from. I did not glare at her. I did not offer a vindictive smirk. I certainly did not offer her a single ounce of pity or lingering anger. I simply looked at her with the cold, absolute, freezing indifference one reserves for a random piece of trash on the street. Unable to bear the crushing weight of my indifferent gaze, Felicity quickly yanked her neon plastic hood back over her head, desperately hiding her face in deep, unbearable shame. She scrambled awkwardly back onto her battered scooter and sped away into the dark, freezing downpour, disappearing entirely from my view and permanently from my life. I turned my attention away from the cold, miserable street and looked back at the incredible warmth of my table. Leo had just finished his spectacular meal, wiping his mouth politely with a crisp white linen napkin. "That was the best dinner ever, Mom," he said, his face glowing with pure, unburdened happiness and absolute security. "Can we come back here to celebrate when I win the science fair next month?" I smiled, a genuine, profound warmth filling my chest and radiating through my soul. "Absolutely, sweetheart," I told him softly. "We can celebrate anything you want." I reached across the pristine white tablecloth and picked up my heavy crystal glass of sparkling water. Leo eagerly picked up his tall glass of milk. We leaned in toward each other, gently tapping the heavy crystal together.
The clear musical chime rang perfectly over the soft, elegant jazz playing in the background. People often say that success is the best revenge, but they are fundamentally wrong. Success is merely the baseline expectation for someone who knows their true worth. The reality is much colder, much more profound, and infinitely more satisfying. The ultimate revenge is not about proving toxic people wrong. It is about rendering them entirely, pathetically irrelevant. Living a brilliantly successful life, creating an impenetrable fortress of absolute security for the people you truly love, and permanently stripping toxic parasites of their power to ever hurt you again. That is not just a successful revenge strategy. It is the most devastating, absolute, and sweetest punishment of all. The most profound lesson extracted from this narrative is that true power does not stem from destroying those who have wronged you, but from the absolute and unapologetic reclamation of your own worth. For decades, the protagonist operated under the illusion that compliance and silent endurance would eventually earn her the familial love and respect she was inherently owed. Society conditions women to be the peacekeepers, the quiet martyrs, who absorb the toxic projections of insecure relatives to maintain a fragile, fabricated harmony. However, the turning point occurs the moment she shatters this paradigm. She realizes that seeking validation from a system designed to exploit her is a profound waste of her brilliance. True wealth and success are not merely financial metrics. They serve as an impenetrable fortress of boundaries. By strategically building her empire in silence, she stripped her abusers of their primary weapon, which was their assumed control over her reality. The narrative brilliantly demonstrates that the ultimate victory is rendering your abusers entirely irrelevant. When you stop fighting for a seat at a table that was built to diminish you and instead construct your own table, you instantly neutralize their influence. Her journey highlights the necessity of severing ties with toxic environments without carrying the burden of misplaced guilt. Loyalty to blood should never supersede loyalty to your own psychological survival and the safety of your children. The ultimate revenge is a life beautifully lived, wholly unaffected by the opinions of those who once sought your ruin. It is the realization that your energy is your most valuable currency, and investing it in your own growth yields the highest possible return. Your success becomes the impenetrable shield that guarantees your safety and peace of mind. Take control of your own narrative today by walking away from any relationship that demands your diminishment in exchange for acceptance.